Good morning, Ethan.
Good morning, Gabe.
Well, boy, do we have quite an interesting battery of subjects to discuss this morning. Now, before we get started, I did want to just recommend something to everybody. So I have this friend Thomas Murphy, who's a translator and a software engineer, and he is a really interesting fellow, and he recommended this album to me called Teimo, Teimo, by a German ambient music producer named Thomas Köner, Koner. This album came out in 1992. I was talking with some friends about it last night, and they said that it was such a fascinating and exciting album because it felt like they were able to listen to it and it kind of afforded them space to think. It didn't kind of drown out their faculties and thought processes. So, highly recommend that you folks check this out. Also, obligatory mention of the kind of experimental rock opera weird band. I'm wearing their shirt today, Elizabeth Color Wheel. I think they broke up last year, but I definitely recommend that you listen to this band as well. Now, Ethan, before we start today, have you got any things that are on your mind or anything that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
No, nothing in particular. I think that one of the books that I've been going through recently, and that's made actually two of them, both have made a pretty big impact on me, and that's Luther's Bondage of Will, which, as I described to you earlier, is somewhat of a nasty gram from Luther to Erasmus. So the it's pretty coarse to read, but very intriguing, very thought-provoking, and has made a huge impact on our society. So definitely worthwhile to read, whether you agree with Luther, whether you are a Lutheran or not, whether you are a Christian or not. It's a worthwhile book to read. And then St. Augustine's Confessions has been phenomenal. And one of the things that is so interesting to me as I read many of these authors from time past is that they're very relatable. All of them are very much human beings who have experienced a lot of things in their life, experienced trials, excitement, difficulties, and are extremely relatable even to people who live in a world so drastically and distinctly different than the world that they lived in. So I highly recommend both of them. I will probably recommend them again because it will take me a while to read through them, and they're also great books. So,
Good. Yeah, and I know that we actually intend to do a whole episode about Augustine's Confessions at some point. I've actually been reading recently. Augustine is quite an interesting figure in the history of Christianity, particularly with respect to Michael Hudson's work, where Michael Hudson speaks about how kind of Jesus Christ himself, and in fact, Mosaic law and kind of pre-Christian Judaism really was kind of centered around the good news for the poor, or kind of the liberation of people who are enslaved for various reasons, but primarily people who are in great debt or people who are enslaved for debt reasons. And I've apparently recently found that Augustine was a key figure in the redirection of Christianity away from an emphasis on debt cancellation and justice uh, in the economic sense. So I think that that
interesting.
will indeed play a role in our deeper discussion about Augustine when that time arrives. Quite interesting.
Was that I'm sure we'll dive into it, but I'm curious whether that was under his bishophood in Hippo, or whether or not that predated that.
I don't know. I truly couldn't tell you at this time. I've only done a very little bit of preliminary reading on that, so
Well, I can't wait to talk about it.
I can't either. It's going to be awesome. But for today, we've got some really fascinating things on the docket. I think we'd like to start with something that I've been thinking about and speaking about recently. I have this friend, Tony. He is atonal.u on Instagram, and he's kind of I would call him an intuitive abstract artist who does a lot of like typography work and iconography work. He does some painting, very interesting artist. And I was speaking with him recently about this thing that I'm about to mention, which is that I have a new idea for a theory of originality. And I will say, if y'all listened to our first episode about Amazon and representational art, you will see how the thread kind of continues on from that discussion into this theory of originality that I've developed, or that I've sketched out at the very least. Because it's coming from kind of a simultaneous understanding of Kojève's theory of history and his theory of subjectivity in representational art. So here's the theory. I'll try to forego the the extraneous uh, exposition. So, what is it? Well, here's my idea. I think that today, and maybe even not just today, but people, myself included, we tend to think that for something to be truly original, it also, in the same breath, in the same sense, must be truly novel. It must be truly new. Originality, I think, is popularly conceived of as distinct from anything which preceded it, or which perhaps, and this is where it gets, this is where you can start to see my line of thinking emerge, which prefigures it or preconceives it, right? The idea here, and we know from scripture, I believe it's in Ecclesiastes, right, where what remind me, it's David who writes Ecclesiastes, right? No, it's not. Or is it? Who is it?
No, it's Solomon.
Solomon, of course, yes. Doesn't he write that there is nothing new under the sun in
He does.
Ecclesiastes?
He does indeed.
So let's just take that out of context for our own
Well, let me
uses. Oh,
clarify
go ahead.
that
Yes.
there's some debate whether Solomon actually wrote it or whether or not it was someone of Solomon's court, a wise
Right.
man. So I
Isn't
just
that the
want to add
case
that.
with, yes, because that's actually the case with more than just Ecclesiastes, right? Other books attributed to Solomon may be attributed to him due to books being attributed to him that are written by like his people, right?
Yes, I mean this is most definitely true and verified to be true in the Psalms. So
Hmm.
only I think the first 130 Psalms are written by David or are ascribed to David. But as far as Proverbs are concerned, I think there's some question to whether all of the Proverbs were written by Solomon as well. But regardless, it
Sure.
does say there's nothing new under the sun. And indeed, there's nothing new under the sun.
There's nothing new under the sun. And if we take into account that not only do we know from scripture, but honestly, and when we say scripture, of course, I will say Ethan and I are both Christians.
Yes.
And I don't think that it's, uh, you know, drawing back the veil too much to say that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Even though we do like kind of to not be overly pedagogical, I think, on this podcast. I think it's totally fine for us to state those are our priors, our Christian faith and a Christian
Absolutely.
perspective of history. Now, with that in mind, we also know that there are all kinds of other important writers, thinkers, religious figures. People have been saying that there's nothing new under the sun in various ways forever, for as long as human history has been around. And I think that everyone kind of has that sense. There's this idea of, nothing happens is something that you hear people talking about today. And, we don't need to get too far down that road. But what's the basic idea here? I think the basic idea here is everything to me, the way I hear this and read this is everything that happens was prefigured by the history of that thing and by the context of that thing. And not only that, but by everything which is not even immediately related to it in a historical sense.
Mm.
Everything is like everything within time, let's just say within historical time, because Kojève actually draws a distinction between, I believe, three or five different kinds of time. Like there's natural time, historical time, and like cosmological time, which would be like time outside of nature, but we don't need to necessarily get into that stuff right now. The point is that within historical time, nothing is a silo. Nothing is independent of anything else. And so, sorry, I mean, this is surely a long monologue for what my theory of originality is, but here's the idea. My idea is that in order for something to be truly original, original in an objective sense, not just original in somebody's opinion, but what would real originality look like if we were to conceive of it? I think that the best way to imagine true originality, let's just say in a work of art, is that the person who created the work of art had done thorough, extensive research and education on the history of themselves and the work that they produce, such that they are able to consciously create an original synthesis, if you will, not necessarily a new synthesis, but a synthesis of all of these different objects of history of which they are actually aware. Now, what's the alternative? The alternative is that someone kind of goes about creating art in a kind of loose, subconscious, intuitive way where they may create some great things, but they don't necessarily know where they're coming from. They don't know where their work is being drawn from. And
Well, I
so
think,
this is my idea. And Ethan, I want to pass it to you now. I've talked for far too long.
yeah, I think there's some very intriguing points to the proposition or the thesis that you're presenting, and that's one, that the pursuit of originality isn't just distinction. So the intention is not just to distinguish the creation of your labor from all other artists. The and this goes back to our original discussion or our first discussion, which is um and kind of the point that I was driving at, which is the implications of meaning in art and the goal of representing meaning in art. When I was much younger, I used to believe firmly that art was hierarchical, that there was good art and then there was bad art. And the way that you could prescribe whether or not art was good or bad was to compare it to creation. I believe that the universe that we live in is the perfect creation, or rather, the optimal creation. So the closer you get to imitating creation in art, in various mediums, that is that is hierarchically superior to art that deviates from creation. But this, I think, is naive and simplistic. And how I would extrapolate on what I believe about meaning and introducing meaning into art now is that I do think that there is art that is arbitrary, that is bad, that is unmeaningful, that's maybe even unproductive. And I would go so far as, based off of your definition of originality, say uninspired, because it's uninformed by the history of the individual. And this is one of the beautiful things I think about creation and being a creative species is that we get to express our creativity and create things very much in our likeness. And moreover, impute virtues into our art that maybe even we haven't achieved or don't even possess. And I think the modality for presenting those virtues and that meaning can be very diverse. However, I do think that meaning is important to art. And I think forsaking all meaning is to forsake oneself in the expression of art. To forsake, because art, as you said, the originality of art, I think, is springing from one's personal history, and that each individual lives and perceives reality in life and experiences life in a way that is unique from every other person. Not that they're experiencing anything new, because there is nothing new, but they're experiencing it in a way that is unique compared to other people. And when they use art to express that experience in a meaningful way, I believe they've achieved originality. And so I would say that I agree with you on all those points. Is there anything that you find in that that you disagree with?
There is one thing that I am kind of hanging up on when you speak about this, and I want to clarify my theory of originality. It's not just about an artist's awareness of their own history. I think it's actually about an artist's awareness of history itself. And perhaps more specifically, history that in some way pertains to their own work. Maybe you could think, for example, of a painter who, is very much inspired by the Impressionist school or, another art movement like that. And thus, and then in that case, I think that people imagine that I think when I say people, I think frequently when I say people think, people imagine, I mean me. I actually mean me or a former version of me. So I want to clarify that. I don't want to like create this straw man version of all these people, these crazy people out there who think crazy stuff. I really do mean me. So, but like I remember once thinking that, well, I kind of need to be careful about not exposing myself to too much music or to too much writing or to too much art. Because if you do, then you'll end up becoming more and more derivative of the things that you're consuming. But I think
Mm.
that that's actually backwards. I think that not necessarily the more you consume, the better. I definitely don't think that. But I think that if you are selective in what you consume and you consume good things and you don't consume them at an overwhelming rate, then what is produced from that is a conscious synthesis of historically important objects. And that to me is a mark of great art. Now, I'm not saying that, I mean, this is kind of it really is a theory, not in the scientific sense, but in kind of the linguistic or rhetorical sense. I'm not saying that this is a law. I'm not saying that this
Well,
is hard and fast because I think that there are artists that I know who don't really have a historical approach to their work, or they don't really spend time studying history in their free time, but their work speaks volumes regardless. So it is, there are complications here, but I want to pass it back to you. Any comments on that? What do you think? Have I clarified anything here?
yeah, I want to introduce some didactic categorization here. And
Hmm.
that's I kind of hear you saying their history, but you're using it in a dual sense. Their history on a macro context and their history on a micro context. And that distinction that I'm trying to make there is what they've experienced in their life versus the history that's informed what they've experienced their life, almost like this meta history. So I want to address two things. Do you think that meta history is also expressive in microhistory?
What do you mean by expressive in?
So one of the things that, for instance, you said someone who's inspired by a various school of art. Well, would that not be, even though that school of art has its own history of people who have both participated in that school of art as well as contributed in that school of art, but is not being informed by that school of art or that school of teaching or that whatever experience that is that not also the experience of the individual? Is that not also their micro history, even though it is their macro history or meta history?
Well, it certainly becomes a part of it, but it only becomes a part of it if the artist chooses to do it. Like,
You
as
think so?
you, well, here's what I would say. Like, for me, as I begin to read more and more books about a variety of things, the thinkers and the ideas that are being kind of sketched out and developed in these books are, as I choose to expose myself to them, becoming a part of my own personal micro history, if you will. But they may not necessarily have been a part of it, at least not consciously, had I not chosen to study them. Now, would they still be present, but I just wouldn't be aware of them? Well, there's no doubt about that. And maybe that's where you were going.
Yeah, I think that I'm kind of smirking here because I think that it plays directly into our dialogues that we wrote, particularly on free will,
Mm,
because it plays into this illusory truth, this repeated exposure to particular ways of thinking that both consciously and subconsciously influence the way that we interact with the world and our history. So you made a statement about choosing what you expose yourself to
mm.
because that is a choice of what is allowed to influence you. And this is a very intriguing point. If so Romans says, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Mhm.
And that's something that I have meditated a lot on, especially as I have been considering what it means to have free will and what it means to choose a life that is holy or set apart.
Mhm.
And so, this idea of transforming your mind, choosing what transforms your mind, I think is a choice and it is an allowance that we have to make. Do we have an entire allowance? Absolutely not. We have to live in the real world. We have to be exposed to the world. And sometimes those things that we're exposed to are not ideal, are not optimal. In fact, probably all the time are the things that we're exposed to, not ideal and not optimal. But you make this very important point, and that's we we do get some choice. We do get some autonomy. And at least we get some perceived autonomy. We can get into whether or not that's real or perceived. But the point is in that case, is it good to consider whether what we're exposing to ourselves to benefits our school of thought or detracts from our school of thought? And I'm going to make a segue here. How does that translate to the digital age that we live in, where we
Mm.
are surrounded by digital media that is constantly informing our thought processes? So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I love the smooth transition there, and I want to actually bolster your transition by just saying I think that as we talk about this idea of building and creating something as kind of a cup overflowing, if you will, like I think of the project that you and I are embarking on right now as a project that would not have existed if you and I had not realized that we are studying and thinking and learning in such a way that we feel like we need to say something about it. We need to build something relating to it. And so, but here's the thing. That cannot happen if you are not thinking and learning and acting in a way which produces creativity and which produces uh, it's hard to exactly get to say, but I do have a few specific quotes to read here.
Yeah,
Just
please.
I've actually written a little bit about this concept. And so the first thing I want to read is actually a quote from Arthur Schopenhauer's book Essays and Aphorisms. Uh, you know this one because I bring it up somewhat frequently, and I will go ahead and grab it right here. Let's get the quote. I should have had it pulled up previously, but you'll just have to bear with me for one moment. The quote is about reading, which, of course, reading is actually a rather contentious and disappearing practice. So it's somewhat almost irrelevant, but let's just go ahead and read this quote. Here we go. Quote, "The art of not reading is a very important one. It consists in not taking an interest in whatever may be engaging the attention of the general public at any particular time. When some political or ecclesiastical pamphlet or novel or poem is making a great commotion, you should remember that he who writes for fools always finds a large public. A precondition for reading good books is not reading bad ones, for life is short." Now, one may hear this and go, well, this guy is a piece of work, total pretentious nonsense. But I don't think that's quite the case. I mean, I do think that maybe it's a little bit of a self-important sentiment, but I think that there is real value to it, which is that things that people are broadly obsessed with, things which have broad appeal, they may have some value to them, but I think that they frequently are not of great value. And I can think of a million examples from the contemporary world, but let's drill into this concept of digital media. We are going
Yeah,
to talk about social media. We're going to talk about videos. We're
yeah,
going to talk about things that constantly surround us and that bombard us, and that you and I in particular are kind of in our own ways as very different people who still have a lot of remarkable unities between us. We're each kind of figuring out, how do we avoid things that we are starting to realize, or maybe have been realizing for quite some time, do not serve the purposes that we wish to carry on and to promulgate with with our lives. And so that's a bit of a long, contributive intro, but let me pass it back to you. Go ahead and launch into something here. I want to hear from you about, what is this thing that you're talking about lately? You're thinking about trying to excise digital media from your life almost entirely. Why is that? And how do you intend to do it?
yeah. Well, before I dive into that, I want to contribute to what the appeal, or excuse me, I want to contribute to why I believe that popularity may be an indication, or at least a prompt to caution. And that's because things which are popular often appeal to the senses. And this calls back
To the
to
consensus.
not just the consensus, but to the senses,
Oh, the
sensuality.
senses. I
Yeah,
see.
it recalls back to this ultimately accessible sensuality, which I believe that our generation is striving for. The the excess of entertainment is a result of the desire to be, um, and I don't mean this in a Freudian way or in a sexual way, but to be pleasured by the media that we ingest, the technology that we participate. And I mean technology in the McLuhan sense, in the as an extension of human function. And so when we choose to participate in technology, very often we are choosing to participate in something that appeals to the senses, something that alleviates the function of effort. And we know that this is unhealthy. I was listening to a podcast the other day about uh, the importance of walking, and how walking is such a of such import to longevity and health, that cultures where walking is the primary mode of transportation are directly that that lifestyle is directly correlated to longevity and living a longer life and living a healthier life and living a happier life. And so not only is walking so important to our lifespan, but it's also important to our quality of life. And I think that it would be easy to jump to the idea that that's simply because it's exercise, but I don't think that that's the only reason. I do think that walking expands and contracts the blood vessels, which exercises the body's functions and allows people to be healthier. I do believe there is that aspect, but I also believe that there's this aspect of silence and contemplating and thought and observation, which I think contribute to the well-being of individuals. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas vehicles in the locations and the eras that we live in, vehicles are 99% of the mode of transportation. We live our lives going from sitting to standing to in a vehicle to sitting to standing.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't do a lot of walking. But where am I going with all of this? I'm trying to get us to a point where we recognize that technology has introduced this accessibility to uh, to function that was previously reliant on human ability and function and effort. And this also plays into the idea of entertainment, particularly visual entertainment, TV, video games, I think is particularly dangerous.
Mm.
TV, video games, YouTube videos,
Yes.
in what we're doing right now. Um,
Yes.
Listen to it on audio.
Yes. Yeah, honestly, turn your screen off. Just listen to the
Yeah,
audio.
but there is a uh, almost Luciferian sensory appeal,
Mm.
an addiction to pleasure
Mm-hmm.
through visual stimulus that is inherent to human beings and
Mm.
very dangerous and addictive. I think that if I take a moment to consider all of the people I spend time with and what I have in my past spent most of my free time on, I would say that 99% of my free time, the moment that I have between working and sleeping, and I don't even include eating in there because even while I'm eating, oftentimes I would be watching a video, listening to something, watching the TV, etc., even during
Mm-hmm.
dinner times, meal
Mm.
times, all the time. It would be done, um, except for sleeping and working, it would be done intaking visual entertainment. And when I would go over to friend's house, what are we going to do? We're going to watch a movie.
Yep.
We're going to play some video games, especially young guys like us. That's
Mm.
very common. In fact,
Yes.
it's uncommon to find friends who aren't doing that as their default state of late leisure.
Yes.
And so I don't want to continue to monologue here, but I think it's very dangerous. And I remember I was talking to my uncle the other day about how many months of free time. It was a TED talk, I believe. How many months of free time you have in your life. And it's finite, right? All of us are going to die, and we get to
Yes.
choose how we live, how we expend the time that we don't use to work and provide for ourselves and our families. And so how are we going to spend that? Are we going to spend that on sensory pleasure, or are we going to spend that contributing something to the world we live in? Your thoughts?
So great, man. Outstanding. I've got a few things I want to pull in here. There's actually a Foucault quote that I've mentioned to you before, and I think it would kind of tie quite nicely into your discussion of walking. So this excerpt is from Foucault's seminal text, Madness and Civilization, which I read last year, and I very highly recommend to everyone. It's a shocking and demystifying book, to say the least. Although it's also a book that, in its demystification, it does leave you with many questions, which I think is probably a good sign for a book. Listen to this. Travel has the additional interest of acting directly upon the flow of ideas, or at least by a more direct means, since it passes only through the sensations. The variety of the landscape dissipates the melancholic's obstinacy, a remedy in use since antiquity, but which the 18th century prescribed with a new insistence, and whose forms it varied from real travel to the imaginary voyages of literature and the theater. Antoine Le Camus prescribes, quote, in order to relax the brain, in all cases of vaporous affections, the following: walks, journeys, rides, exercise in the fresh air, dancing, spectacles, diverting reading, occupations that can cause the obsessive idea to be forgotten. The country, by the gentleness and variety of its landscapes, wins melancholics from their single obsession, quote, by taking them away from the places that might revive the memory of their sufferings. Now, just a tad bit of context here. It's important to realize what the melancholic, what exactly that is. So, in kind of medicine of antiquity, or in psychology of antiquity, if you will, these are kind of imprecise terms, but they'll just have to do for our purposes. Really, mental health was divided out into two kind of poles. The one pole was hysteria, and the other pole was melancholia. Melancholia was defined as a person who has become completely consumed with the obsession of a single idea and who is unable to really function in any way in during their daily life due to this overwhelming obsession with one particular thing. So it's fascinating to read in Foucault that in the 18th century, in order to cure melancholia, one of the primary prescriptions was, let's go on a walk in the mountains, or let's go on a horseback ride, or let's read some transporting literature that tells us a story about people who are in a faraway land, and it kind of brings our minds to a similar place. I think that that's quite fascinating. I want to let you jump in here before I continue to my next point. What do you think about this?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think about it is I think there are a lot of people who struggle with depression, what we would diagnose as depression. Now, I think depression, number one, is over self-diagnosed, and number two, overdiagnosed. Probably very similar to melancholia. I'm sorry, uh,
Melancholia.
melancholy, in the health system of antiquity, as you stated. And so, with this concept of depression, and I'm certainly not a physician, so this isn't any sort of medical recommendation or anything like that.
Yes.
But
Me
one of
neither.
the things that I've experienced when I've been in moments where I have been in a depressive state, not diagnosed with depression, but in a state where I was melancholy, was were instances where I would extrapolate the state of my life, the problems that I was dealing with, on the rest of my life.
Hmm.
Things will never change. There's no future self that could possibly be different than the self that I'm experiencing right now.
Hmm.
There's no reality in my future that would be different than what I'm feeling right now. And these problems are unable to be overcome. Well, although life is short, we experience it as long. And life changes, and we have a lot of ability to change our circumstances. And one of the ways that we change our circumstances are setting our mind not so much on ourself, setting our mind not so hyper focused on our own feelings, but setting
Yes.
our mind on the reality in the world that we live in
Mm.
outside of ourselves,
Yes.
setting our mind on the people outside of ourselves. Why are you thinking so much about yourself? Why aren't you serving others? Why aren't you focusing on other individuals' needs? You know? And for me, I'm not saying that this is for everyone, but for me, the problem was I was thinking too much about myself.
Mm.
The problem was that I was thinking too much about my problems, which weren't really problems compared to the vast majority of people who have lived throughout history. My problems were insignificant, but to me, they were the hardest things I had ever faced. So to me, they were relatively the hardest. But the reality is that the world doesn't revolve around me. It doesn't revolve around Ethan. It doesn't revolve around Gabe. There are so many others. And we have the opportunity in this life to serve others and to look out for their interests. And this is one of the things, tying it back into the problem of entertainment. This is one of
Mm,
the things that I think is so dangerous about digital entertainment is you can spend your entire life until the point in which you die, because both of us were born when we were born. We could spend from the moment we were born, basically until the point we die, ingesting digital entertainment, consuming digital entertainment. And
yes.
that life is lived completely for oneself and not in the service to others.
I think worse than that, it's not even a life lived for oneself.
Yeah,
It's really a life lived for the utter destruction of oneself and not the denial of oneself. Because the denial of oneself is really the emptying of the cup such that the cup may be filled once again with good things, with service, with love, with the fruits of the Spirit, if you will. But I think that the life spent being drowned in digital media is actually a life of the like, what if you just destroy the cup and there is no more cup? And over time you realize that you don't even have the capacity to think of even yourself or of anybody else. It's a
yeah,
very, very poisonous, dangerous thing.
yeah.
And so I would love to incorporate a little idea that I sketched out relating to this, and I think you'll quite like it. Listen to this quote that or this like little snippet that I wrote. Media like music and literature stimulate one to actively engage with them, which produces mental silence. Newer forms like social media behave otherwise. They overwhelm one's attention with excessive information via noise. Thus, they replace focus with escape. And to me, this is possibly a useful distinction to draw because one might say, well, I mean, honestly, what's the difference between watching a bunch of movies and reading a bunch of books? I mean, you're just like consuming a bunch of media. But I think that there is a type distinction to be made between digital media, which I suppose you could argue that music is in most ways today, as it is consumed, digital. But I think that music still belongs to a different category of media because in my own experience, I actually find that when I'm in a state of depression, I'm unable to really listen to music. I try to, but it doesn't penetrate the cloud, the fog, the thing that haunts me and that keeps me locked in this horrible place. The only thing that I want to do when I am in a state of depression, and I most certainly have been over the course of my life, the only thing that I want to do is distract myself. I want to find things that will transport me away from what I am doing, but I don't want to build something new. And that's the thing that's different about reading a great book when you're in a place of depression, which I have done before, and it has slowly, admittedly, it has slowly helped. I was most recently in a state of depression for a couple of months, and I made effort. I made efforts multiple times to read different books
Hmm.
just to try and get out of that state of extreme selfishness that I experienced depression to be. It's exactly how you were saying it. I wanted to emphasize that the way that you describe your experience of depression is exactly how I experience it too. It's
Yeah,
pretty incredible the way that you articulate it, how similar it is to the way that I would. So I think, and I love that earlier you brought up this idea of silence and how when you're walking, you're necessarily forced, especially if you're not wearing earbuds or something like that, which of course
yeah,
most people will.
yeah,
But if you're just going on a stroll around the neighborhood, maybe you leave your phone at home, your mind is now unoccupied. Your mind is unoccupied. And what is the kind of natural consequence of an unoccupied, unburdened mind? Well, it's probably imagination.
yeah.
And I think that imagination is something that we unfortunately see less and less in today's world. And I think that we also see imagination, we do see imagination, but we see it employed to unproductive ends. You can
Yeah.
look at somebody like Mr. Beast as a great example of somebody who is certainly creative, but who is creating possibly the most diabolical object ever created. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. No, I just want to emphasize this concept that I've been thinking about a lot. And before I do that, a thought that came to mind while you were speaking was in regards to uh, the popularity of meditation. And also this concept of the popularity of discipline, because people are starved for discipline. People are starved for silence. And such that the idea of meditation is so spiritually refreshing, even just, trying to take some time for quiet is so spiritually refreshing to most people that it's becoming this popular or very popular and at least anecdotally talked about practice.
Hmm.
But for us as Christians, this is no foreign thing. The scripture uh, prescribes to be silent and to know that He is God,
Yes. Be
to
still and know.
be
Hmm.
still and know. And And that stillness for me is so refreshing. It's something that I try and practice every morning, and
Mm.
I highly recommend it. But one of the things that I've also thought about is I have some good friends, and we've all in our life, I think, struggled with addiction because addiction is the inability to forfeit. I'm not, I'm not a doctor, but my definition of addiction is the inability to forfeit any particular thing.
Mm.
Um, and if you say I can give it up, but you never give it up, can
Mm.
you really give it up?
Hmm.
You say, "Oh, I could give it up, but I just enjoy doing it. I could give up watching TV every night before I go to bed, but I just enjoy doing it."
I could give up scrolling on Twitter every night before I go to sleep in my bed, but I just enjoy doing it.
And what about my friends? What about these relationships? I'm investing in relationships and I'm connecting with people and I'm writing and I'm reading and I'm thinking, but can you give it up? And this is a big challenge to myself. I want to, in my life, I've considered potentially taking years of fasting from, I say fasting, but years of forfeiting digital visual entertainment, movies, TV shows, and video games. And you know what? This is a really big challenge because guess what? I go to my friend's house. What do they want to do? They want to watch a movie. But trust me, my friends, I know my friends well enough to know that they love me well enough, and that they want to spend time with me enough to do something other than that. Um, and if they have to forfeit that to spend time with me, I don't think that they would have any issue with it. And that I'm extremely grateful to have such amazing friends. Not everyone does have friends who would, it's either, hey, you're getting on the bandwagon, we're going to watch this movie, or you're not, you know. And some of the
Yes.
things I've put into practice in my life is getting rid of my smartphone, which I highly recommend. Do it. Everyone should do it. In my opinion, everyone should get rid of their smartphone.
Mm.
And you can think about, well, what about banking? You can do banking on your laptop.
Yep.
Okay, well, what about GPS? They sell GPSs, or you could learn where you're going, you know, one of those two options. And even just reducing it, just like don't pick up your smartphone before you go, like 2 hours before you go to bed. Don't watch
Yes.
TV after you get home from work,
Yes.
you know?
You got to start somewhere.
And these disciplines, in my life, they've made such a big impact.
Me too. Yeah, 100%. Sorry, go ahead.
Please.
Hold on. Are you still there?
Yes. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay.
What are your thoughts?
So I wanted to actually, there are a lot of things here. I wanted to read a few great Bible verses relating to silence. Proverbs 17:28 says, "Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent."
Makes you wonder what we're doing here.
No, quite true. We just hope and pray that the things that proceed from our lips here are not foolish.
Yeah, Lord willing.
Lamentations 3:26. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Exodus 14:14. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent.
Wow.
Let's see. Maybe one more. Revelation chapter 8, verse 1. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. That is quite fascinating. Silence is obviously a very important concept in scripture. And I don't want to drill too deep on that because I'd actually like for us to do an episode that's more focused on silence itself.
Yeah, and
Because
you recently had an experience
I
kind of
did,
practicing silence as almost this event, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
yeah, I'd love to. I'll just touch on it briefly because I'd rather save it and talk about it. Maybe we can have an episode that's maybe more centered on it because this one
Okay.
I want to be a little broader on digital media
Yeah. Yeah, let's
and
dive back into
history.
that. Yeah.
But basically, yes, there was an event that I got to participate in where the event was come down to Chinatown to this kind of event space where we do a variety of things. Come and from 6 p.m. to midnight, sit on the ground on these cushions in silence. Do not bring a book. Do not bring your phone. Do not write anything. Don't occupy yourself with actually doing any activity. Just be silent for 6 hours. Now, it's interesting. There were some people who came and left after 10 minutes. I myself stayed for 5 hours.
Yeah. And
And
it
I
sounds
found
really,
that, go ahead.
sorry, please.
No, no. What were you going to say?
I was gonna say it sounds really artsy fartsy, but it's I think it's a really intriguing exercise, especially something that's so culturally different than the world that we live in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was grand. And I've had a lot of thoughts about silence since then. So it's something that we'll dig more into later. I'd love to talk in more detail about that. Might have a guest or two come on to help us talk about it. I think that would be great. But one thing I wanted to mention is I last episode I talked about this guy Barrett Avner who has this podcast called Contain, and he recently, I guess it wasn't even that recently. It was actually about a year ago. He did an episode with the cyber ethnographer and professor Ruby Justice Thelot. I believe I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. And the episode is really all about the thing that we're talking about, which is to say, kind of history and its relationship with the digital age and the internet. And specifically, one of the things that they talk about is videos as a form which bombards all of us with images at such an incredibly rapid rate. And this is actually something that, as we get deeper into McLuhan, I think that he'll be able to inform
Yes.
us about how the media environment of the digital age is kind of, particularly the television. The television is so formative and interesting as an object of media or as a form of media because it is the kind of it's like someone beaming tons and tons and tons of images into a person at a far more rapid rate than could have ever been done in the past. And so I will say this. I have not yet gotten rid of my smartphone nor my social media, but as of this year, I have I have enacted a new very strict policy on myself, which is that I watch no videos at
Mm,
all. Now, I may occasionally break that. Like I recently, there's this extraordinary experimental percussionist and composer named Eli Keszler, who had a live performance that I wanted to watch. I think that to me, that is an acceptable kind of video media to occasionally consume. But my goal is certainly, without question, no curated short form video content
Oh,
ever again
yes.
in my life. There is
Yep.
almost, I think I recently wrote, let me just see if I can pull this up. I recently wrote, uh, give me just a second. I recently wrote one of the surest ways to poison your soul is to inundate it with curated short form video content. Stop watching it. I'm dead serious. And I really do believe that. And I know the reason I believe it is because I've done it. I've seen it. And I have also seen the miraculous, radical difference that has the change that has taken place in me since I have enacted this new policy. Now, the policy that I wish to kind of, I want to append something to this policy, which is I also really am an appreciator of film. I love watching good movies, but I would only like to watch a maximum of maybe two movies a month, probably just one. And the great thing about having that kind of policy kind of imposed upon yourself by yourself is it forces you to make a very conscious choice as to what will my one movie for this month be. You're not just going to choose some random movie. You're going to go, huh, well, I know I've been really wanting to watch that that Tarkovsky movie for a while. Like, let me go
Hmm.
watch that. Let me go watch a movie that's going to be edifying and constructive, and it's going to say something valuable to me that I'd like to learn from.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pass it back to you. Thoughts on any of that? And there, I've got some more stuff to say about your line of thought, but I just am throwing a lot of stuff at you right now, man.
Yeah, there are good movies out there. And let's be clear, or I want to be clear. I want to clarify that there's a reason why this stuff is addictive, and it's because it is very entertaining. And in some respects, it can even be beautiful. It can even be stunning. It can even be visually magnificent. And yet, I don't believe it adds value to one's life. And this is something that I've considered a lot over the past year, and we've talked about, or last 2, 3 years, honestly. And it's the difference between like consumptive versus productive hobbies. Are you going to spend your times on things where you're just consuming something, or are you going to spend time on things that are going to be producing things? And not that consumptive hobbies are bad. I would say reading a book is consumptive because you're consuming something that someone else has written. I don't think it's bad, but I think that for me, distinguishing between those two activities has allowed me to consider, well, I don't want to spend all my time just consuming. I want to produce. I want to write. I want to. I picked up blacksmithing and forging, and that's been a wonderful hobby of mine. Um, and the wonderful thing is that because, and we talked about Amazon, because we live in a culture of accessibility more now than ever, anyone can get into almost any craft. The barrier to entry is extremely low. I mean, we're talking about less than $1,000 to start in almost any craft. And now $1,000 is no small amount of money for sure, but you can work an extra 2 weekends, 3 weekends, 4 weekends, save up $1,000 and get into a craft that people would, that would be passed down for generations. And you can learn that craft and you can practice and you can do it the hard way. You can learn the hard way, make mistakes. I just think it's a very beneficial exercise for me to break out how I spend my time in those two categories. But in regards to uh, digital media. Well, my wife and I, we recently watched The Count of Monte Cristo, not the very first one, but the second one. And it had, um, oh, I can't remember the actor's name, but regardless, It was a phenomenal movie. Uh, I'm sure the book is even better. And I would like to read the book. And I believe that where you can consume a movie, you probably also can consume a book. And it may be that silence, that observation, that contemplation may be more valuable. Again, I don't think that it's sinful. I don't think it's evil to watch digital media. But is it dangerous? Yes. Just like climbing a cliff is dangerous,
Hmm.
you know.
But
So
it can be worth it. And that's the thing that you're saying
can be
is that,
worth it.
and this is the thing, I don't want people to think that we're not fundamentalists is a good way of putting it. Like the way that we're approaching this topic is not necessarily a condemnation of a form or of a group of forms. It's more just an analysis of how do these forms behave and how do they impact and shape us. And that's
Yes.
another important aspect. And of course,
Yes.
McLuhan is perfect person to be talking about relating to that because you think about what would happen to a person. I mean, you and I actually both are familiar with an anecdote of a person who spent 30, 40 years of their life just watching TV for their entire life.
Yep.
And the thing that's important to recognize with particularly, well, really all media forms, is they all shape you in a particular way.
Absolutely.
And what that means is you probably want to be very conscious of what you are putting into yourself because what you are putting in will come out. And of
Yeah.
course, this is just classic folk wisdom from my parents and from their parents and from all everybody's parents. Everybody knows that this is the case, but I think that it's so easy to consume things that you don't really have an opinion on whether or not you should be consuming it by just, oh, quickly visiting the Explore tab on your Instagram app. And then, bam, an hour later, you've just spent all of that time on Instagram Reels watching videos that probably you don't even remember the moment you move on to the next activity, but they are shaping you. They are
Absolutely.
definitely shaping you. They are shaping you ideologically and politically. They're also shaping you in a more fundamental sense. They're shaping your essentially the kind of attention that you are able to apply to activities.
Yeah.
And so
And this is,
it's important to be aware of these things and then to make decisions accordingly.
yeah, I once worked with a gentleman who believed that the end purpose of man was to experience as much as he possibly could. And I disagree with this greatly because not everything is worth experiencing. It goes back to the quote that you read, and I think it was very poignant. And there are things in this life, and this is a very I think this is a very controversial concept now in the world that we live, but there are things in this life that are not worth doing. There are things in this life that will not add value to your life. You can spend your entire life consuming, and that is a poor life to live. And and when we think about the concept of illusory truth, which is just this idea that if you're not familiar, it's this idea where if you're exposed to a concept repeatedly, you start believing this to be true. And marketing companies, billions of dollars are made. I'm not sure of the exact figure, but significant amount of money is made in how to convince people to believe a certain thing. And it's not done in vain. It's successful. And so that doesn't mean that we're hopeless, but we should make choices. Gabe, I think you should make choices, and I believe it about myself, where we expose ourselves to material that allows us to, not, number one, allows us to consider the truth value of it, and number two, is not designed to stimulate our thought and surpass our critical thinking. I don't suggest that we should be sophists and just question everything and believe nothing, which I think we should do an episode on that. But I am suggesting that we spend our time on things that add value and and convey meaning. And when we talk about art, when we talk about representing ourselves in a piece of art, in something that we produce, when we talk about producing something that that flows from a history of ourselves, we have to ask the question, is there a history to be produced? Is there a self to be conveyed? And is that self something that we want to convey? Is that self something that we want to put into a piece of art? Are we happy with the history that we've allowed ourselves to participate in? Are we satisfied with the experiences that we have cultivated in our lives? And that starts with our disciplines and how we spend the hour after we get home, the hour before we go to work, or a couple hours before we go to work. It starts there. It starts with those small disciplines because they add up. They add up.
They do. I'm just really pleased to hear all of your insights. I want to make one more contribution before we kind of start to move in the direction of wrapping up this episode. This is a footnote from the lectures on the phenomenology of spirit delivered by Alexander Kojève. And I think that this really is kind of something that can tie together the different things we've been talking about today. Not that they haven't been tied, but I think that this will do well. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this after I finish reading it. It is in the lack of historical memory or understanding that the mortal danger of nihilism or skepticism resides, which would negate everything without preserving anything, even in the form of memory. A society that spends its time listening to the radically nonconformist intellectual who amuses himself by verbally negating any given at all, even the sublimated given preserved in historical remembrance solely because it is a given, ends up sinking into inactive anarchy and disappearing.
What a great
Likewise,
quote.
oh yes, oh, it continues. Likewise, the revolutionary who dreams of a permanent revolution that negates every type of tradition and takes no account of the concrete past except to overcome it necessarily ends up either in the nothingness of social anarchy or in annulling himself physically and politically. Only the revolutionary who manages to maintain or reestablish historical tradition by preserving in a positive memory the given present, which he himself has relegated to the past by his negation, succeeds in creating a new historical world capable of existing. What do you think?
Yeah. Um, I think it's a great place to end.
I agree.
Thanks, Gabe.
You want to just drop it off?
I think that was great.
Awesome.
I'm excited to have our next conversation. I would love to dive into I would love to dive into sophistry, which I think
Yes.
this plays very well into. I'm not
Hmm.
sure this will be the next episode. At some point, I would like to.
Of
I would like
course.
to dive into Augustine's Confessions. I would like to continue our discussion of meaning
Yes. And
and
silence.
silence.
And particularly, I want to focus an episode at some point upon social media and upon your discussion of the smartphone, because I have a friend, August Lamb, who's a writer who actually, I believe you've read a little bit of her work, who is very much on the same track that we are. I think it would be great to have her on as a guest to
Yeah,
discuss these things.
that'd be excellent. And I guess with that, Gabe, for you, I recommend take the rest of the day, no visual media, no YouTube, no TV, no movies, if possible. I don't know what you got going on today, but just my recommendation. And I'll try to do the same here.
Sounds great to me, man. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.
All right.